catalyzed the Industrial Revolution. Started out being steam operated, later became electrical. They have a special motor run. All the equipment is run from one power source through belts, and you could hear yourself think when you went in there.
Classic example of early American industrialization, which then of course took off and grew and just went amok, you know, at once it started.
You got to say to yourself, why there?
Okay.
And the answer to that is, Rice's Landing is a natural river port. And there were packet boats up and down the river just like interstate trucks. Dozens and dozens of them all day long. And they needed repairs. And that was the first function of that shop. It was the center of the community. It was the first place that you could make a phone call. It was the first place you could buy gasoline. It provided employment. During the war, it provided job training. It was rented by the U.S. government during the war to train apprentices. It was the center of the community.
At the most, the two brothers worked there, and that was probably the most of the employees. So as far as being a huge employer, it wasn't. But it was a business. So that business brought a lot of money into the community through, well, they had to buy raw materials, they had to buy supplies. That was our first hardware store.
If nothing else, you gain a respect for the danger, the dirt, the terrible conditions that built this country and built its industry.
Well, if it's saved, it's the building's wood. It just needs a lot of care. It's like any old building. It's completely furnished. When they close the door, they just close the door. All the equipment's there. The equipment was used when it was started in 1900, so you can imagine how old the equipment is. Some of it came from the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, they say. That's before my time, so. Well, the Foundry was really a job shop. It didn't produce anything. They made parts for the coal mines, both Mather, Crucible, Nemacolin, and parts for the boats, steamboats, parts, anybody who needed a piece made. The old story goes about Carl, his son-in-law, called him to the phone and said Mather had a great big order, and he said, well, you have to tell them they have to wait because I'm busy with a customer. Well, the customer happened to be a little boy with a broken bicycle.
Yeah, they actually had stairs from the front of the shop down to the river. They tied boats up and did boiler repairs there. The boiler repairs led to repair parts, which were hard to get and hard to ship. So they made them. They started casting parts in a foundry, and that led to machining the parts that they had cast. That was the beginning of the shop.
How this country was created through people like him. And because I think it's we're losing this in our society. Lots of ways we've lost it, but we're losing this, and that people should have the opportunity to see something like this. And it's a little humbling when you stand there, too, and I think society needs to be humbled somewhat these days, and just envision what their work day was like. And they would work, long hours, and they didn't even have electric to begin with, So, and to see what can be done just by working with your hands, and I think it's a real necessary part.
That you could walk in fact, you could did. Walked in there with a drawing, and they made it. All kinds of things. Well, you can't do that anymore. That's lost because of modern technology and modern industry.
Well, it's probably the only machine shop of its type in Foundry on the East Coast. So during the war, there were a lot of times it was in operation at night. They trained women to make shell casings there. They didn't make them, but they trained the women to operate the machines. And so later the women would go out and go on the assembly line and make shell casings.
They dug a grease pit in the floor of the foundry, and they serviced and repaired automobiles until they closed. In other words, the riverboats, business of the riverboats were replaced by the railroad. Okay. They then did work for the coal mines and other local industries like ferry boats, but the main income was gone, and they kept cutting back. They did a lot of automobile work until they closed. I restored every one of them. Everything, I have run every bit of it, but the cupola in the foundry, and there's a 300-ton press in the back room that I did not ever try to run, but everything else runs.
And it is incredible. I mean, you walk in and it's actually as if they just got up and left from work the night before and just shut the doors. I mean, everything, there's pieces of little shards and little springy pieces of metal laying everywhere from when they've shaved it off of a piece. And the forms are still up, and there's a little hardware store upstairs, which is, the time is taking its toll on it. But that's another thing. I mean, he sold little pieces of hardware, you know, screws and bolts and nuts. And so it really is just like walking into the past. I mean, it makes you feel different. I mean, you get a very nostalgic feel. And when you look around at the machines and what they did, you get this kind of incredulous feeling that these people actually were able to do what they did. I mean, it does feel good. But and really, when they run those belts, even when the PBS came down to film that time, and they were all going again, it gives me goosebumps.
Thousands of people have toured the place just basically by word of mouth. But they're people with a limited interest who understand, who want to see that thing. In other words, the average person, you know, they'd rather go to Kennywood than there.
It's real important that it be saved as is. Travel the highways and you see signs that says, once upon a time there such and such stood here. Well, that place is still standing, and we need to keep it standing. And so that we don't have to put up a sign that said, once upon a time the WA Foundry stood here.